Now, the airline industry is a tough business at the best of times, and operators face many challenges. The South African aviation sector has been under extreme pressure in 2013, from deregulation and leveling playing fields to bailouts, legal challenges, foreign ownership, and even stalled takeoffs. Joining us in studio for a closer look at the year that was is Dr. Joachim Vermooten. He's an aviation and transport economist and consultant. Thank you so much for making the time, Joachim. Let's quickly look at the broad trends. If we were to reflect back on the year 2013, what are the major trends in the industry?
Well, the major trends in the industry is that the worldwide airlines actually became profitable in 2010 and remained so, and is increasingly so during 2013.
And how does Africa, and in particular South Africa, compare with that trend? Are we in line?
Well, Kenya Airways have just converted into a profit, so they're on the go, but in South Africa things have really not worked out.
Right, I want to come back to Kenya Airways, but before I do that, I mean, let's look at the African aviation industry from a continental perspective, and oftentimes criticized for poor performance as against the relatively high demand that we see for air travel. How are we supposed to be bridging the gap between performance and demand?
Well, the crucial issue is commercial viability. Airlines need to be commercial viable to be able to make profits, declare dividends and reinvest in equipment. Otherwise you get stuck in older equipment that's uneconomical, and from then on you run into losses which never ends. And
losses that obviously lead to bailout after bailout, as we've seen in the South African industry.
Well, unfortunately that's not the only cause. I think the biggest cause in South Africa has been that SA doesn't pass on increases in its operating cost.
Right.
The most important element is fuel. They do recover fuel surcharges or fuel levies, but in their last financial year, fuel increased by about 2.2 million, and they only recovered about 638 million of it.
A very small fraction of that entire bill.
So they missed out on about 1.5 billion of under-recoveries, and that's a quick fix.
Right.
You know, compared to the declared loss of 1.3
But Joachim, that's really interesting if you think of the fact that despite those obvious challenges that South African Airways is having, we hear of their expansion plans into West Africa. What's your view on that?
Well, their expansion plans is over-optimistic. But first on West Africa, SA hasn't been very successful with these type of ventures. They tried one before, that's Air Tanzania. And that was basically going too big too soon in a place that they didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
The crucial issue is why is it necessary for South African taxpayers to actually fund a start-up operation there? There's no real benefit for South Africans and the South African public in something like that. It's got extreme risk, it's got market and commercial conditions that we are not accustomed to. And it might not end up in a pretty picture. So
obviously not a very optimistic outlook from you on that one, but let's look at another player that's almost going in a similar route. If we look at Kenya Airways, a national carrier again, making an announcement just earlier this week that they are going to go into the low-cost carrier environment. What's your take on that?
The whole issue of low-cost carriers is something that's very important. Airlines that are full-service carriers that have gone into low-cost carriers have not done well. It's only where there is a complete segregation in the routes that they operate, like in Australia, where they actually perform well and build markets. But once low-cost carriers compete with a full-service carrier, it becomes a cannibal and actually devours the full-service carrier. So that's not a very happy situation, and that's what we have in South Africa with Mango, which is actually SA's biggest competitor.
Right. Speaking about competitiveness, I mean, it's often said that it's without disagreement that liberalization is the way to go in the aviation industry. Where does this leave the national carrier?
Yeah, I think liberalization has many, many benefits. On the international side, we've seen a tremendous growth in international tourists brought by foreign airlines. So if we restricted that too much for the national carrier's benefit, we wouldn't have seen the tourist development that we actually enjoyed.
Right.
On the domestic market, it's already a fact that we moved away from a statutory monopoly, but contrary to expectations, the state's role has not declined, but it's busy increasing, and we need to get that right. We need a lower level of state operations. It may be smaller, but it could be very profitable and well contained, and private sector operations.